Adrian's world faded into a dull haze. The pain in his side pulsed like fire, but it was nothing compared to the agony of watching Isabella's tear-streaked face as she clutched his hand. "Stay with me," she begged, pressing her trembling hands over his wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Please, Adrian." His breath was shallow, his vision blurring at the edges. He fought against the darkness pulling him under, clinging to the warmth of her touch, the desperation in her voice. But he could hear Victor's footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate. "You were never meant to have her," Victor murmured. "This was always going to end this way." Isabella's emerald eyes flared with fury. "You're a monster." Victor sighed as if her words bored him. "And what are you?" "A Loran who thought she could rewrite fate." He crouched beside them, his dagger still dripping red. "I'll give you a choice, Isabella. Leave him now and return to your family, and I'll let you live." Her grip on Adrian tightened. "Never." Victor shook his head, standing. "Then you leave me no choice." Adrian knew what was coming before he saw Victor's signal. One of the guards stepped forward, sword raised. Isabella's scream rang out as the blade slashed down. And then chaos. A deafening gunshot split the air. The guard's body jerked before collapsing lifelessly beside Adrian. More shots followed, shouts echoing in the night. A group of figures emerged from the trees, Loran guards. Isabella's people. Victor cursed under his breath, stepping back as the Lawrence rushed forward, weapons drawn. "This isn't over," he spat before disappearing into the trees with his men. Isabella turned back to Adrian, her hands cupping his face. "Stay with me, love. You're safe now." But the darkness had already claimed him. When Adrian woke, the air smelled of lavender and burning wood. He was in an unfamiliar bed, his body wrapped in fresh bandages, his wound tightly stitched. Pain still throbbed in his side, but he was alive. A soft rustling made him turn his head. Isabella sat beside him, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. But the moment she saw him awake, relief broke across her features. "You scared me," she whispered, brushing her fingers over his cheek. Adrian swallowed, his throat dry. "Where are we?" "My family's estate," she admitted hesitantly. "I brought you here after," she trailed off, pain flickering in her eyes. "After Victor tried to kill him. After everything shattered." Adrian forced himself up despite the pain. "Isabella, we have to leave. If your family finds out I'm here." "They already know." His blood turned to ice. "And they haven't killed me?" She shook her head. "Not yet. But my father, he wants to speak with you." Adrian exhaled sharply. Lord Loran was as ruthless as his own father. If he hadn't ordered Adrian's execution immediately, it could only mean one thing: he had something worse planned. "Is this a trap?" Adrian asked. "I don't know," Isabella admitted, gripping his hand. "But I won't let them hurt you. I swear it." Footsteps echoed outside the door. It creaked open, revealing a tall figure with cold gray eyes, Lord Loran himself. Adrian tensed, bracing for the worst. The man studied him in silence before speaking. "You should have died in that forest, Montclair." Isabella stiffened. "Father." He raised a hand to silence her. "You're lucky my daughter begged for your life." His gaze darkened. "But that mercy won't last forever." Adrian met his stare, refusing to back down. "Then tell me what you want." Lord Loran smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "A deal." A chill ran down Adrian's spine. Whatever was coming next would change everything. Before he could respond, the door swung open again, and a servant rushed in. "My lord," he said breathlessly, "a message just arrived. The Montclairs know Adrian is here. They're demanding his return, or there will be war." Silence fell over the room. Isabella's fingers tightened around Adrian's hand. Lord Loran exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "Of course they do." He turned his gaze back to Adrian. "You see, boy, this is what happens when you play with fire." Adrian clenched his jaw. "I never wanted war." "Neither did I," Loran replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But now, I have two choices. Hand you over to your father, or use you as leverage." His eyes flickered toward Isabella. "Unless, of course, you're willing to make a more beneficial arrangement." Adrian's stomach twisted. He knew what was coming. "You marry Isabella," Loran continued, his voice low, measured, "and I'll grant you protection. The Montclairs won't dare attack if our families are bound by blood." Isabella inhaled sharply. "Father." "I'm speaking to him," Loran interrupted. "What do you say, Adrian? A marriage or a war?" Adrian felt Isabella's fingers tremble against his. This was everything he had wanted, to be with her, to belong to her, without the threat of death. But not like this. Not as a pawn in a political game. And yet, if he refused, he would be dead by sunrise. Victor would come for him. His father would demand his blood. He looked at Isabella, her emerald eyes searching his for answers, for hope. Adrian took a breath, his decision weighing heavier than any sword he had ever lifted. This was it, the moment that would change everything. Adrian's breath felt heavy as Lord Lawrence's words settled over him like a noose tightening around his neck. A marriage or a war? Those were his only choices. His gaze flickered to Isabella, searching for something, reassurance, resistance, anything. But her face was unreadable, her fingers trembling only slightly in his grasp. The weight of the moment bore down on him. If he agreed, he would be bound to Isabella forever, but at what cost? Their love was real, but this was not how they were meant to have it. Not as a political arrangement, not as a desperate bargain to avoid bloodshed. But if he refused, he would die, and Isabella would be left at the mercy of whatever future her father decided for her. Lord Laurent arched a brow. Well, Adrian swallowed hard. And if I say yes, you'll protect me from my family? Laurent gave a slow nod. You will become one of us. Laurent, your past as a Montclair will be irrelevant. Adrian clenched his jaw. His past could never be erased. His father, his brother, Victor, they would never let this go. Even if he married Isabella, war would still come. The Montclairs would see it as betrayal. Still, he met Lawrence's cold gaze and spoke the words that sealed his fate. I'll do it. Isabella sucked in a breath. Her grip on his hand tightened, but she said nothing. Lawrence's expression didn't change, as if he had expected no other answer. Good, he said simply. The wedding will take place in 3 days. 3 days. Adrian felt a strange weight settle over him. No joy, no relief. Only the quiet acceptance that his life was no longer his own. Laurent turned to leave, but stopped at the door. I trust you won't try anything foolish in the meantime, he said. I would hate for my generosity to turn into something less pleasant. And with that, he was gone. The silence left behind was suffocating. Adrian turned to Isabella, searching for something, anger, resentment, understanding. But her face was pale, her lips pressed together in a thin line. You don't have to do this, she whispered. Adrian exhaled sharply. If I don't, I'm dead, and your father will still find a way to use you as a pawn. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. It shouldn't be like this. I know, he said, but this way we'll be together. Maybe not the way we dreamed, but... A sudden knock interrupted them. The door creaked open, and a maid stepped inside, her eyes darting nervously between them. My lady, she said quietly, your mother wishes to speak with you. Isabella hesitated, looking back at Adrian as if she didn't want to leave him alone. I'll be fine, he assured her. Go. She squeezed his hand before following the maid out the door. Adrian let out a slow breath and leaned back against the pillows. His body still ached, but the pain was nothing compared to the storm raging in his mind. He had made his choice. Now he had to survive it. The following days passed in a blur. Preparations for the wedding moved quickly. Servants bustled through the halls, the estate transformed with banners and flowers. It was surreal, watching a celebration unfold around him when he felt like a prisoner in a gilded cage. Isabella was distant, her smiles forced, her eyes clouded with worry. Adrian knew she was struggling just as much as he was, but there was no escape from this path they had been forced onto. And then, the night before the wedding, everything changed. A note was slipped beneath Adrian's door. A single piece of parchment with only 3 words. Do not trust her. His blood ran cold. Who had sent it? Who was her? Isabella? Her mother? Someone else entirely? His mind raced with possibilities, but before he could think too deeply, a soft knock came at his door. Isabella. She stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. She looked beautiful even in the dim candlelight, but there was something different about her tonight. A tension in her posture. I had to see you, she whispered. Before tomorrow. Adrian studied her carefully. Something's wrong. She hesitated before nodding. I overheard my father speaking with his advisors. She swallowed. Adrian, he never planned to keep his word. A chill ran through him. What do you mean? Her hands clenched at her sides. Even if you marry me, he's going to kill you. He just needs time to secure an alliance with another family first. Once that happens, you'll be disposable. Adrian's pulse pounded. Why are you telling me this now? Because I can't lose you, she said, stepping closer. We have to leave. Tonight. Adrian's mind spun. He had suspected Laurent would betray him, but hearing Isabella confirm it made it real. But running now, it was dangerous. The estate was heavily guarded, and if they were caught, it would be a death sentence for both of them. Still, staying meant certain death. He cupped Isabella's face in his hands. "Are you sure?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I would rather die running with you than watch them take you from me." Adrian's heart clenched. Then there was no choice. They had to escape. Midnight. The estate was quiet, but guards patrolled the corridors, their movements precise, methodical. Adrian and Isabella moved silently, slipping through the shadows. Every step brought them closer to freedom and closer to danger. As they neared the stables, Adrian's fingers tightened around the dagger he had stolen. Just in case. Then suddenly footsteps. A figure stepped into their path. Victor. Adrian froze, his blood running ice cold. His brother stood there, arms crossed, a knowing smirk on his lips. "I was wondering when you'd try this," Victor murmured. Isabella stiffened beside Adrian. Victor shook his head. "Did you really think you could just walk away? That I'd let you?" Adrian's grip on the dagger tightened. Victor smiled darkly. "You have two choices, little brother. Surrender now, or I drag your lifeless body back to our father." Adrian's heart pounded. There was no way out of this without a fight, and the only way to survive was to kill his own brother. A cold wind cut through the night as Adrian faced his brother. The moon cast long shadows across the courtyard, illuminating Victor's calculating gaze. The smirk on his lips was one Adrian knew well, the one he wore when he was certain of his victory. "You don't have to do this," Adrian said, his grip tightening around the dagger in his hand. Victor chuckled, shaking his head. "You still don't understand, do you?" His eyes flickered to Isabella. "This isn't about you, Adrian. This is about loyalty. About blood. You turned your back on us, and there's only one way this ends." Adrian's pulse pounded in his ears. He had always known this moment might come, brother against brother, Montclair against Montclair. But knowing it didn't make it any easier. "Please, Victor," Isabella whispered, stepping forward. "You don't have to be like your father." Victor's jaw tensed. For a split second, something unreadable passed through his eyes. But then he drew his sword. "No more talking," he said. "This ends now." Victor lunged. Adrian barely had time to react. He sidestepped, bringing up his dagger, but Victor was faster. Steel clashed, sparks flying in the darkness. Every blow sent shockwaves through Adrian's arms, but he refused to back down. Victor was relentless, pressing forward with brutal strikes. "You were always the weak one," he sneered, slashing at Adrian's side. "Always soft. Always a fool." Adrian gritted his teeth, blocking another strike. "And you were always a coward," he shot back. "Too afraid to make your own choices. Too afraid to be anything but our father's puppet." Victor roared in fury, swinging wildly. It was the opening Adrian needed. He ducked low, pivoting behind his brother. In a heartbeat, he drove his dagger into Victor's side. Victor gasped, his body jerking in shock. His sword slipped from his fingers, clattering against the stone. He staggered back, gripping the wound as blood seeped through his fingers. Adrian caught him before he collapsed completely, lowering him to the ground. Victor coughed, blood staining his lips. His eyes, so much like Adrian's, were filled with something that almost looked like regret. "You," Victor exhaled sharply. "You actually did it." Adrian swallowed hard. "I didn't want to." Victor let out a breathless chuckle. "But you did." He shuddered, his grip loosening. "Guess you're not so weak after all." His eyes fluttered closed. His body stilled. And just like that, Adrian's brother was gone. A sharp sob broke the silence. Isabella knelt beside him, her hands trembling. "Adrian." Adrian closed his eyes, his chest tightening. He had won. But at what cost? There was no time to mourn. Voices rang out in the distance, guards, drawn by the sound of the fight. They had to leave now. "Come on," he said hoarsely, pulling Isabella to her feet. "We have to go." They sprinted toward the stables, mounting the horses Isabella had prepared earlier. As they galloped into the night, the estate shrinking behind them, Adrian knew there was no going back. They had severed all ties. They were fugitives now, but they were free. Days turned to weeks as they fled across the countryside. Each night was spent in a new place, never staying long enough to be found. They had gold, supplies, enough to survive, but the weight of what they had left behind never truly faded. One evening, as they sat by a quiet riverbank, Isabella rested her head on Adrian's shoulder. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. Adrian stared at the water, watching the ripples shift and break apart. "No," he said finally, "but I wish things had been different." She laced her fingers through his. "So do I." A comfortable silence settled between them. For the first time in what felt like forever, There was no fear, no threats looming over them. Just the sound of the river, the warmth of each other's presence. And yet, Adrian knew their past would never truly leave them. The Montclairs would hunt him. The Lawrence would never forgive Isabella for running. But they had each other. And no matter what came next, they would face it together. Because their love had defied fate. It had survived war. And as long as they had each other, it would survive anything. And that, my friends, is the end of Adrian and Isabella's journey. But what do you think happens next? Do they truly find peace, or will their past catch up to them? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more thrilling tales. Until next time, keep dreaming, keep believing, and keep fighting for love.